Hello everyone, welcome back to the Rational Brit. In our previous video, we examined Operation Absolute Resolve and whether the US military extraction of Nicolás Maduro was a good idea. Today, we're looking at something equally fascinating, how China has responded to these events. And what we're seeing is a masterclass in what I'm calling strategic caution, Beijing talking tough while acting very, very carefully. Let's start with what China has said publicly, because the rhetoric has been absolutely scathing. China's foreign ministry and UN representatives have pulled no punches. They've accused the United States of blatant theft and international piracy in reference to the naval blockades and tanker seizures that preceded the raid. They've called the military operation a violation of the UN Charter and an act of unilateral bullying. China's deputy permanent representative to the UN warned that these actions threaten peace and security in Latin America and urged respect for Venezuela's sovereignty. Strong words, the kind of language that suggests serious opposition. But here's where it gets interesting. What has China actually done in response? The answer is remarkably little, and that tells us far more than the rhetoric does. Let's talk about the timing of something quite extraordinary. Hours before the United States announced the raid and Maduro's capture on January 3rd, Maduro met with Chu Shaoqi, China's special representative on Latin American affairs, at the Miraflores Palace. They reportedly reaffirmed their strategic relationship. Now, think about the timing here. This meeting happens. Hours later, over 150 American aircraft are launching for the most audacious military operation in recent memory. Did China know? Did they have any intelligence suggesting what was coming? We don't know, but what we do know is revealing. They sent a diplomat to shake hands and reaffirm relationships, and then nothing. No military response, no Emergency Security Council meeting, no threats of retaliation. Just a handshake and platitudes about strategic partnership. This is what I mean by strategic caution. China wanted to be seen supporting Maduro symbolically, but not so committed that they'd have to do anything substantive about it. And look at what happened immediately after the raid. China issued a travel advisory, urgent warnings for Chinese citizens to avoid Venezuela, to stay indoors if they're already there, to avoid conflict zones. That's not the behavior of a country preparing to stand shoulder to shoulder with an ally. That's the behavior of a country trying to protect its nationals while staying well clear of the crossfire. Let's zoom out and look at China's actual interests in Venezuela, because this explains everything. China has approximately $60 billion in loans to Venezuela. That's not a small amount. Venezuela has been paying those back primarily through oil shipments, the classic oil for goods arrangement. China also signed a zero-tariff trade agreement with Venezuela in late 2025, just months ago. So, China has significant economic interests here. But here's the crucial point. Those interests are precisely why China won't risk a confrontation with the United States over this. Think about it from China's perspective. Yes, they've invested heavily in Venezuela, but those investments are already shaky given Venezuela's economic collapse under Maduro. Throwing good money after bad, or worse, risking conflict with the United States doesn't help China recover those investments. It just compounds the problem. China is playing the long game here. They'll continue to frame themselves as defenders of sovereignty and champions of the global South against American hegemony. That narrative has value in Beijing's broader strategic competition with Washington, but they're not going to let Venezuela become the hill they die on. Let's be very clear about what China hasn't done, because in geopolitics, what doesn't happen is often as important as what does happen. China has provided zero direct military support to Venezuela. None. No military advisors, no equipment shipments, no naval vessels in the Caribbean. When the US was preparing this operation, when American aircraft were launching from 20 different bases, China was nowhere to be seen militarily. This is in contrast to, say, Syria, where Russia maintained a military presence and actively defended the Assad regime. China could have sent ships, they could have provided air defense systems, they could have done any number of things to raise the costs of American action. They chose not to. Why? Because China understands the fundamental asymmetry here. Venezuela is in America's backyard. The US has overwhelming military superiority in the Western Hemisphere. Any Chinese attempt at military intervention would be frankly futile at best and catastrophically escalatory at worst. Moreover, China is desperately trying to avoid further antagonizing the United States while their economy is struggling with deflationary pressures and a property sector crisis. Getting into a shooting match over Venezuela serves absolutely none of China's core interests. Now, there's another dimension to this that's worth exploring, what this tells us about Chinese alliance commitments more broadly. If you're a smaller nation considering alignment with China as a counterweight to US power, this should give you pause. When push came to shove, when an ostensible partner was facing the most serious threat imaginable, the military extraction of its head of state, China offered strong words, and that's about it. Now, to be fair to China, what exactly were they supposed to do? Start World War III over Venezuela? That's clearly unreasonable, but that's precisely the point. China's ability to project power beyond its immediate region is limited. Its willingness to take serious risks for partners outside its core interests is even more limited. This creates an interesting dynamic. China benefits geopolitically from being seen as an alternative to American power. Countries unhappy with US policy can theoretically turn to Beijing, but when those countries actually need serious support against American pressure, what can China realistically provide? Economic ties, certainly. Diplomatic cover at the UN, sure. But meaningful security guarantees? The Venezuela situation suggests the answer is no. Let's talk about the economic angle more deeply, because I think this is where China's calculation becomes most clear. China is worried about US sanctions on the Chinese banking system. This is the real constraint. If China were to provide substantial support to Venezuela in defiance of US policy, Washington could retaliate by sanctioning Chinese financial institutions involved in Venezuelan transactions. Given the interconnectedness of global finance and China's economic vulnerabilities, that's a risk China simply won't take. So, we see this interesting pattern. China continues oil-for-goods deals with Venezuela, but structures them carefully to minimize sanction exposure. They make symbolic gestures of support, but nothing that would trigger serious US retaliation. This is strategic caution in action. China wants to be seen standing up to Maduro symbolically, but not so committed that they have to do anything substantive about it. Now let's consider what this means for the broader US-China relationship and the international order. On one level, this is reassuring. Despite intense strategic competition, both powers are showing restraint. China didn't escalate, the US conducted its operation but didn't directly target Chinese interests. Both sides seem to understand that some conflicts aren't worth the risk of broader confrontation. But on another level, this reveals the limits of multipolarity. For all the talk of a multipolar world where China and others can balance American power, when America decides to act decisively in its sphere of influence, the balancing really doesn't happen. China complains but doesn't meaningfully resist. This might embolden the United States to take more unilateral actions, believing that Chinese opposition will remain rhetorical, or it might frustrate China, leading them to look for opportunities to push back more forcefully in areas where they have greater advantage: Taiwan, the South China Sea, their own backyard. Here's the narrative China is constructing, and we should pay attention to it because narratives matter in international politics. Beijing is framing this entire episode as proof that the United States remains a hegemonic bully that violates international law when convenient. They're using this to position themselves as defenders of sovereignty and the rules-based order. Ironic given China's own behavior in places like the South China Sea, but effective nonetheless among many developing nations. Never mind that China's respect for sovereignty is selective. Never mind that they're doing nothing substantive for Venezuela. The narrative is what matters, and China is winning the narrative battle in many parts of the world, even as they lose the practical one. So, what does all this tell us? A few things. First, rhetoric and reality often diverge dramatically in international relations. China sounds furious, but acts cautiously. That caution tells us more about their actual priorities than any official statement. Second, economic interdependence creates real constraints. China won't risk its financial system for Venezuela. That's a crucial limit to how far strategic competition will go.
Third, the international order remains fundamentally shaped by regional power dynamics. In the Western Hemisphere, American power is overwhelming, and China can't meaningfully counterbalance it, regardless of rhetoric. Fourth, alliance commitments from great powers are highly contextual. China will support Venezuela when it's cheap to do so, but not when it's costly. The United States has shown similar selectivity throughout history. This is just how great power politics works. And finally, we're seeing the shape of US-China competition more clearly. It's intense, it's multifaceted, but both sides are trying to compete without tipping into direct conflict. Venezuela became a test case for that dynamic, and what we've learned is that both powers will prioritize avoiding escalation over defending principles. Whether you find that reassuring or troubling probably depends on your perspective. It's reassuring that we're not stumbling into World War III. It's troubling that principles like sovereignty are defended or ignored based entirely on convenience and power calculations. So what happens next? China will continue to support whoever ends up governing Venezuela, assuming they're willing to maintain economic ties. They'll continue to criticize American actions in international forums. They'll continue to position themselves as an alternative to US power. But they won't put their money where their mouth is. They won't take serious risks. They'll keep playing the long game, trying to win the narrative battle while avoiding the actual fight. And in a strange way, that's probably the best outcome we could hope for from a dangerous situation. Not ideal, not principled, but pragmatic enough to avoid wider catastrophe. Thank you for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on China's response and what it tells us about the future of great power competition. As always, keep the discussion civil and thoughtful. Until next time, stay rational.